Mickey. So I'm going to introduce our panel. Mickey's going to join the panel. We've got some really great thinkers with us here tonight. First up, Lydia Chilton. Lydia is Assistant Professor of Computer Science here at Columbia. Lydia's expertise is human-computer interaction and collaboration. Here she's focused on AI and computational design to enhance people's productivity and problem solving. Matt Jones. Matt is also here at Columbia. He's the James R. Barker Professor of Contemporary Civilization. His specialty is the history of science and technology. For the Center of Science and Society, he oversees big data and science studies research, the research cluster, and that focuses on history and the social, political, and ethical ramifications of data. So clearly, we've got an optimistic view here, but Matt and Lydia, we're counting on you to help punch some holes in this, help us think through where we go. And lastly, and importantly, I'd like to invite Alison Lord and introduce you to Alison. Alison is the global head of talent at the Google Creative Lab. Now, Alison has a really unique role of hiring and developing a creative team in a technology company. And Alison and her team use both human and machine capabilities to do their work. So I think she represents a really great mashup of what we've been talking about. And also, she's here to represent the practical applications to help us make sense of this. Does this really work at a workplace? So that's who we have assembled here. The goal is for the next 25 minutes or so, we're going to have some conversation amongst ourselves. And then we're going to ask you to ask some questions and stir it up from there. So that's the goal for the rest of our time together. So remind you why we're here. Mickey set it up, I thought, really well, gave us a very compelling framework. It's but one framework, but why we're here is this notion of what would it take to create a playlist for yourself. It could be a playlist for tomorrow. It could be a playlist for you 20 years from now. What are the tools, the skills, the mindsets that are required? So we're going to peer into the future, but I want to make sure we make it very practical. And I hope we leave here with a couple of things you feel like, okay, I can actually put this to action in the near term. So first, I just want to ask our panel, what's your reaction? You saw Mickey's presentation. You had a chance to read some of the work he's done. As I said, this is but one framework. But give us a sense of this, some context. I thought, for one, there are limits to human intelligence. It's great to think, I'd love to think this machine's going to make us all more intelligent. It may make us better versions of ourselves, but there's some things it's not going to do. So Lydia, let's just go down the line. Give us some reaction to what you think about this, and as someone who's a designer and a computer scientist, how do you think about this?
So on one level, totally agree. Lots of power in this generativity, so very motivating. At a deeper level, what am I going to do next? How am I going to go and implement this? What am I going to do when I wake up tomorrow and I want to start being more generative? Humans are very often constrained by our habits, what we're used to, what our colleagues around us will not call us crazy for doing. And so I think there is this, how do I start tomorrow? One solution would be to start a cult. I don't love that solution. Oh, wow. Okay. Well, we'd need a leader. So, Mickey, you got the job.
Did you think this is what you were saying before? One of the acolytes, I think.
Okay. Well, position is open. Yeah. Anyone want to be a cult leader? Yeah. Come down.
It's been done before with science fiction authors. They've started successful cults just for fun. So, I think it's possible.
Okay. Well, let's not start that precedent. Okay. But basically, there needs to be a set of a community of people who all sort of believe this thing that we're not entirely sure how it's going to happen, but we believe it's true. And there need to be things that we can do, both individually and together.
Rituals, maybe, too. Yeah. I'm just trying to think of a good
Well, what you're
cult.
outlining is really a model for how the future gets made and how we humans change. We fall in line around an idea we believe, and we try to make it happen. So
yes, absolutely.
Maybe Matt, movement instead of cult. Just a movement would be nice.
So Matt, how about you?
Following this language of ritual and spontaneity, that is actually going to be one of the fundamental issues here is the danger in thinking in corporate organization and university settings is, of course, that often we do get entranced with our rituals, particular rituals, and sometimes those are very disciplinary training that's enabling, but they also can be disabling. So the set of things I was wondering as you were speaking is, on the one hand, it's very clear the kinds of new functional literacies that right now many people need. And the question is, what are the different forms of critical literacies that people are going to need precisely to avoid falling into traps of being dictated by systems rather than the systems dictating to them? And that could be algorithmic systems, it could be business models, it could be intellectual property models, and other sorts of things. So as important as I think maybe any particular bit of technical practice would be precisely what is the purchase that we need on it, and how possibly do we train students, co-workers, and other sorts of people in the kind of picture you present.
What would be a couple of your top literacies that you would encourage people to invest in?
Well, I think, the vocationally as a historian of technology, we have one job, and that job is to say that it ain't necessarily so. There is no internal dynamic to technology, and beyond that, there's no dynamic of technology that says society has to change in a particular way. So I think one of the fundamental literacies is to recognize that often those things which masquerade as necessary social change, as because of technology, are often decisions not to face up to what are the conditions that allow that to be. It doesn't mean that we're not going to have that social change, it means it's not given. So that would be one. But as I said, they could also be deeply ones that could go deep into the dangers of the particular affordances, say, of Autodesk. And it also could be the affordances of, say, the current model of how we consider something to be a monopolistic organization or something. All of those, I think, are critical literacies that we're going to need if something like this model is to succeed.
Alison, how about you?
Well, I'm going to dumb it down a little here after Matthew. Lydia and I were having a really interesting conversation as we were chatting beforehand, and I think it relates to the critical stimulus to this notion of learning. I work in a tiny, tiny team. We are 85 people within the enormity of Google, and we hire people who are creative by discipline as opposed to inherent creativity, right? So writers, designers, creative technologists, so not software engineers, people who make other types of things with code or makers, physical makers. And we have this expression of starting with one. So rather than trying to solve a total system, finding one user, one instance of a problem that needs to be solved, and then building from there. And I think that's interesting from the standpoint of that thought of, I can't innovate because innovation is too big a concept and a construct. How do I start? Where am I going? What am I going to do when I wake up tomorrow? Just trying to find that one problem that needs to be solved as opposed to trying to solve all problems. But I love the idea of filling in gaps. And one of the things we look at a corporate level for people you're trying to develop is constantly, who is my mentor? How do I find that person? And there are elements of chemistry that are vitally important in that type of relationship, but often finding someone that is the yin to your yang from a skill set perspective, it's impossible. It happens by chance. And so I think tools that allow us to have a better grasp of our own skill basis and where we need to go and where we want to go and how to build that are vitally important to the future.
I think one of the things I like, Nikki, that you lay out here is this lifelong learning journey that I think it's almost starting to become a buzzword, lifelong journey, lifelong learning. But you're making it serious. I mean, it's a really lovely vision. What are some of the things what kind of reaction are you getting to that and other concepts as you talk about this?
Well, it's fascinating. So a few years ago, I decided to do my own experiment in lifelong learning, and I became an exit-level intern. And the idea was I would get away from the day-to-day of what I was doing and running a P&L and hiring people and all that stuff, and I would become an intern again. And it was an experiment in cross-generational learning. Who could be my mentor?
Where did you work?
Well, in this case, Netta, who's sitting in the audience, was my boss. So the idea was an exit-level, entry-level intern program, where she'd be my boss, she'd own the budget, she'd own the research agenda. I just said, hey, there's this cool book I wrote, I'm interested in this topic. Over the summer, when she was here being my boss, I disappeared for a week, and she changed the research topic. And I came back, and I'm like, that's not what we were doing. And she's like, you were gone. I think this is more interesting, it's bigger. And I think this is true, Netta. And I came back, and we had like 6 weeks left. And I was like, okay, you're my boss. Are you sure? And she's like, I'm sure. And I am so much more excited now because she pivoted into something that is so much bigger and harder and interesting. There are like 12 PhDs hidden in this. And it's a big vein, and after her research and I don't know how many hundreds of papers, she's like, nobody is focusing on this. So it actually, as a student, it opened me back up again. And I think this idea of cross-generational learning, which helps lifelong learning, has already been shown to help with lower healthcare rates. You have people that are retiring. The baby boom generation doesn't feel like retiring, by the way. And so we're starting to see, like, they're like, no, I want my 3rd chapter. No, I want my 4th chapter. And ASU, Arizona State University, is building a condo in the middle of their campus for cross-generational learning and living, where they explicitly are getting people over 65 to be part of the maker community. So I think there's something interesting here that it lights us up.
That'd be a good sitcom idea to take college students in assisted
That's
living
right.
Center and mash it up. And
Maybe
see what
Friends
happens.
with The Odd Couple.
The Golden Girls.
Or the Golden Girls.
Shatner would do it.
Shatner would do it. But I also think that there's, so I think positive feedback now. I think that people are realizing they're doing this. We're starting to see some of those customers actually thinking about not letting people retire so soon, or maybe inviting them back after they're retired and saying
it's a great
something like,
concept.
because we want their wisdom or we want their stuff. I do think in this conversation, I would agree violently with a lot of what you said. I think this sense of monopoly is really worrying me. By the way, if Autodesk disappeared tomorrow, that would not be so good, because every car on the road is designed in it, and every 80% of all the buildings, and most of Hollywood for special effects. So it would be nice to have other people doing this stuff. And I think actually the senior leadership kind of gets that, but they're driven by, it's a public company. So I'd like to see a lot more people adopting this notion of this, but finding their own way through it. Like this idea of, I'd love portable credentials that went with me from tool to job, my whole life, not locked in.
Yeah, I want to come back
data.
to credentialing. Lydia, how do we think about, as we look at this mashup of human learning and machine learning, your line of work is design thinking, computational science. How do you start to think about this? I know problem solving is one of your areas of expertise. That's one of the critical skills we're trying to bring forth. How might we design for this?
Well, the first thing is that identifying the problem and understanding the environment is often the most challenging part. If you take my class, I'll say that about 1,000,000 times, and by right now you might not understand it, but by the end you'll definitely agree, because it seems like there's all these problems lying around, and like global warming, that's a problem. Well, it's really more of a domain of a problem, and sort of like Alison was saying, like we've got to pick one example in each one. So I don't know, people are like, okay, well, like world peace, like let's do that. I'm like, can you get your brothers and sisters to stop arguing? Like if you can't do that, why are you gonna go to some other country and try to figure this out? So there's always something local that's not as grand, but is more in front of you, intangible, that you can start to do something with. And that's where you're making and trying to understand what these problems are. So framing it is really important. I do not know of any computational tool to help you with that yet.
And you also have a concept you talk about that you call increasing the system has to increase the value. Talk a little bit about that. How do we think about that?
Yeah, so you're not just making stuff. I mean, sometimes that's rewarding to just make a thing and like, ooh, yay, I exercised my creativity, and you should do that for fun. But you should also be thinking about, particularly as an engineer, what person is going to use this, and how is it going to help them save time, money, or expand their options? Those are the big three. And very often when you get really caught up in like, how's this widget gonna work and how am I gonna do that? But then sometimes if you take the bigger picture and like, who's the user? What are they gonna do with it? That can help you really focus on the one thing you're trying to help them do well. Rather than have 1,000,000 features, once you've been around for 20 years, you will be as bloated a software product as Microsoft Word and have 1,000,000 features and they will all be in the long tail. But right now, you've got to do one thing well and know who that person is.
I love your problem finding, because if you noticed in that generative design thing, you actually have to define the problem. Like, what are the dimensions of the problem? And we noticed that designers who try to use these tools originally, they try to take a specification document. And you can't actually figure out what the real problem framing is. And we don't teach problem framing that much in school.
Well, and I saw that in companies too.
Yeah.
I think you do things often because you can, not because you should. And you
Yeah.
don't start with that simple question, what problem are we trying to solve? Matt, give us a view. You're a historian and somebody who knows technology. I mean, walk us through, we're sort of at these Nikki showed us we're in this valley and this potential optimistic future. Give us a sense of history. How have we navigated these kind of troughs and valleys and peaks in the past? Help us think about it.
I mean, okay, there's a million examples, and as a historian,
Pick
of course,
one.
I have 47 slides. No, I was trying to think what would be the sort of useful sort of things, and I actually think if you were to think about the fate of printing in the movable type, it would be an interesting example rather than something more contemporary like the automobile or something, though those would be interesting. Why that? So not very long after movable type came to Europe, there was a sort of bust and boom phenomenon, not unlike our current moment of pessimism about the internet. There was the Barlows of the early 1500s, and a moment in which Europe was literally being torn apart, driven by propaganda in printed form. It seemed that these new media technologies and the new ways of thinking that came along them were eminently destructive. Now, getting that genie back in the bottle is a totally non-trivial question, and it involved immense fighting over what, say, do you license text? Do you control it? What are the conditions under which people have ownership in that? And then how do you understand what creativity is like in that sort of world?
Wait, I'm sorry, are you talking about now or 500 years ago?
500 years ago. But the point is,
It's a great example.
the point
Very
is, it was
contemporary.
very easy for state-driven actors to use propaganda to drive people into two opposing camps. And it was done by artists of the highest caliber. And this new technology is also something that carried with it dangers. It carried with it dangers particularly. People learned not to memorize as well. That was lost. Now, there's probably a net gain in that, and many of us thought that. Those kinds of give and take, I think, are extremely common in all sorts of technology.
But we haven't learned this phrase we talk a lot about now, unintended consequences. I mean, you're outlining a lot of unintended consequences from the printing press that we've all survived. But yet we get so caught up in the optimism, we often don't think about the risk.
Well, but the survival, I mean, I think you could take a lot of cases, pharmaceuticals in the middle of the 20th century, aspects of the internet, the book, we survived, but it's only because there were lots of moments in which there was a decision to say, look, this is not an autonomous technology that is just going to develop. And it's because people in various ways channeled it. And you might say they put brakes on it, but I think channeled is a way. They adapted it. So one of the adaptations is you invented the table of contents and the index. You drove that, because that was that was a means of technology as important as the invention of PageRank in 1996, a crucially transformative thing. But these are intentional things that happen that themselves then have unintentional effects. Now, whether in the long term we're going to survive technology is really going to depend on what you think is going to happen with carbon in the atmosphere. It may be we're all wrong about this. So you could look at lots of examples, but I think what you would find is there's key moments, for example, in 1962 when we started in the United States to use randomized controlled trials in the pharmaceutical industry, and I think we're all thankful for that. And that's not an obvious thing to have happened. It wasn't obvious in 1961, and it was obvious by 1970.
Thank you, very helpful. So I want to take a minute and kind of level set. I want to look at some of the skills, the tools, the mindsets. Alison, you and your colleagues at Google have done some very interesting work looking in the HR area, the human resources area, looking at data of what it takes to be a successful leader, to be a successful teammate. I think you've called it Project Aristotle. What's the other one? It's Project Oxygen. Can you give us a sense of some of the insights from that? I think people would find that really interesting.
Yeah, so it started with Project Aristotle, and there's a great New York Times Magazine article with a lot of details about the inception of this and the follow-through. And there was work done. We have surveys constantly. We have a large sample size with our employees and all of the teams as to which teams were performing from an output perspective at the highest level. That's obvious. You can look at that throughput, look at the quantitative lines of code that have been written, how successful are the products. But then there's also sort of Geist about people and how they're feeling and how they're doing. And this project was born of looking at the highest performing teams and trying to understand what was it that was making them. And you would have certain assumptions about, in a very data-driven, analytic, high-output company, a high-performing team having a dogmatic leader, very strong, aggressive policies. And in fact, what was discovered was that it was completely the opposite. it was the team that seemed to waste 10 or 15 minutes at the start of every meeting, kind of, shooting the shit. How are you doing? Teams that had higher degrees of empathy between the manager and the teammates. And so this segued into what's Project Oxygen, which is essentially judging at the manager level which managers are most effective in managing their teams. And what's found is that these qualities, and it's funny, I said, Beth, I gotta look up some of this stuff. But, because it's in my mind, but not necessarily articulated in the formal way that it is. And I made my own little assortment of what I consider, there are 10 qualities that are literally measured about managers at Google. And the underpinning of it is really vision and technical skills in combination, right? So you have to have a high degree of technical capacity at whatever your particular thing is, and you need to be able to impart a vision to your team. Then you need to empower them. They need to feel empowered to execute that vision. So it's not a command and control type of environment, which also inherently means that people that are in the team need to have the same type of capacity and skill. You need to be good at communicating. You need to be results oriented, right? So this is not a touchy-feely, happy-go-lucky situation. It's obviously a very driven alpha sort of environment. But then you need to make them feel you are concerned about their well-being and that you are inclusive of them as a person. And this is the place where I think, thinking about the future and these diverse teams, think of the typical high-performing alpha leader. They are not necessarily naturally inclusive and acknowledging of others' humanity around them. And this is a critical skill. And you see it in school-age children. And a lot of the things that I see, I have 2 teenage daughters, the skills that they have related to other humans are far outpace my own. And I am so grateful to the educational institutions which have helped them get there. But that is a big thing that needs to be conquered. And then, collaboration across Google. That's an interesting thing to me. Not just within the team, but people need to see leaders modeling behavior of collaborating outside of the team. And then decision making. So again, this is not a sort of touchy-feely, everybody's getting a soccer medal type of situation. There's a good deal of rigor and performance expectation, but married with an essential acknowledgement of humanity. And I think that's super interesting as a mashup, in particular in a technology company, right? When we're looking at this human-machine interplay.
Yeah, I want to take that and move into a university setting. I mean, because of what you're laying out, I think, and what this generative model is laying out, I think, is much more of a model of collaboration, getting feedback. I think in some ways you could argue it's kind of a new collective mind is what we're talking about. So one of the questions I have is, what happens to majors or functions in companies? I mean, how do you think about majors in a university, or what would be a model of learning we might take from this in universities? How are you guys thinking of this today?
Wow. Okay, well, you sort of blew my mind. So give me a sec to recover from that. What if majors went away? First, do I still get tenure in my department? So I'm worried about myself first.
Let's come to credentialing next.
Yeah, well, I would like to think that in most majors, you learn kind of the same things, but in different flavors. We should compare notes to see sometime. You learn critical things. So maybe it doesn't matter that much. In fact, since computer science has a lot of jobs and needs a lot of people, we're creating these what we call bridge programs to take someone who did any field in undergrad and just get them up to speed in computer science so they can do the master's. And we're learning that it's not that hard. If you have foundations of things that you already know and can sort of carefully think through a problem, then learning the mechanics of code is not that much different than anything else, and you can really add on to that in easy ways. So I think we're actually already at the point where it's possible, and that's always been true. We just haven't thought that way about it. And I
know in a business setting, I saw we move from functional teams to more mission-based teams. And so it wasn't about the function or the major as to what are you trying to accomplish, which was kind of set up in your problem solving.
Yeah, that said, across disciplines, there are challenges in working of different language, different incentives. So it does take some of this, asking people how they're doing and getting a sense of what they value to get those teams to work together. I don't know, we should try doing something together and see what a mess it is.
How do you think about that, Matt? I mean, in some ways that's what CSS is about, trying to bring more of these intersections across the university.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so just getting back to our slightly earlier conversation about sort of a tension between lifelong learning and, say, an older vision of what one might come out of a university education, I think there's a tension there in that generally what we're talking about today and celebrating is something in which you are not narrowly vocationally trained, because you are constantly changing. But the way that often the whisperers to academic deans sound, it sounds like what people want are undergraduate and graduate degrees to be more like vocational training. And what I'm hearing, and my own sense, is it's precisely wrong. So the question then is, if we're expecting a lifetime of all kinds of the development of new sorts of skills of the kind that you just beautifully articulated, what's the seedbed of that going to look like? And that's going to mean, what do we do with those areas where people buckle down into an academic discipline? What do we do with general education more generally? And where do we get these things like collaboration and other sorts of things? So if before I was talking at a really grandiose level, I think right now is a great moment for experimenting in this sort of thing. And so I've been very involved with co-teaching with a colleague in our applied physics department who's the chief data scientist of the New York Times. And our desire, we created a general education class, an introduction to the history and ethics and politics of data, and there we are attempting to instantiate what would it mean to design a class that would be both for those who see themselves as future CEOs and those who see themselves as future technology leaders, and those who see themselves as future senators. And what would that skill set be? And really, how would we actually teach this? And it's extremely experimental and iterative and all these good sorts of things, because we're actively trying to say, how could we teach this?
Yeah, it's interesting. Mickey, how would you solve these
Well,
challenges
I don't have a
that they
solution for this.
figure out?
But I do think one of the things I've been watching is when I ran a design lab at Maya out at Carnegie Mellon for a long time, one of the things we had cognitive psychologists, we had anthropologists, we had ethnographers, people who understood people. But they went to school for a totally different thing. They were taught truth is over there. And then we had engineers and electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, physicists. They were taught a totally different thing. And they were taught truth is over there. They had their own jargon. They had their own secret code for everything. People love acronyms. And then we had a whole other group of people like me, product designers, architects, filmmakers, game designers, and they learned truth was over there. And one of the things you had to do at Maya, and I didn't create it, but the founders did, was you had to read the classic tombs, the classic works of the other disciplines. So if you were a designer, you had to read Herb Simon's Sciences of the Artificial, because you had to understand economics and cognitive psychology. If you were a cognitive psychologist, you had to read Raymond Loewy's Never Leave Well Enough Alone, which was the kind of expansion of industrial design. And you had to read the Mythical Man Month, I think, as well, to understand engineers sometimes. But the whole point was learning enough to have trust in someone that doesn't speak your language. And so a lot of what we found was, how do you accelerate trust? And how do you trust there's a there if they are speaking a different language? And so we did an awful lot of work around how do you build accelerated trust, and how do you get away from dilettantes? Because I think dilettantes are very different than amateurs. Dilettantes are like, I could write code, so I guess I could build this web page, do human-centered design, run a business. Where you were so excited about your mastery in one thing that you can apply it everywhere. Amateurs, on the other hand, get deep into something, become a master at something if they choose, go really deep. And I love people who go really deep. We never would hire somebody that was a jack of all trades, master of one, or master of none. We would always hire them that at least had one deep skill, because they flew all the way to the bottom. They were not 10,000 feet up, sort of armchair critics. But this notion of kind of how do you build trust, and then how do you find methods that help you appreciate someone who's gone deep, and appreciate someone who's making weird connections after they've gone deep, because they're realizing their depth won't solve this, and they have to go across. So I think system thinking and interdisciplinary or anti-disciplinary literacies feel like a really important literacy for this. And it's not easy. It's not, let's get everyone together and we'll have a conference meeting or something. That's exactly what you said. It's very driven by mission. So I do think this you can't solve it all.
There's a word you use in one of your papers about unlearning. I mean, I think the notion of things that you don't need to know that are no longer useful is a really interesting concept.
Well, and how do we take let's say I learn how to use a hammer. Great, this is how you hold it. That's the thing you put it in with. The other side you take it out with. You hurt your thumb a bunch of times. You end up building stuff. You become a master carpenter. I worked with carpenters for years. Turns out that's going to get automated at some point. I don't know. Robots are going to hammer things together. But the skill or the mindset I look for is measure twice, cut once. Like, because there's this there's an underlying thing. They don't need to know how to use that hammer anymore, but I love the quality that comes from a carpenter that's figured out, to get it done right, I'm going to have to measure a few times and do this. So it's a mindset.
I like all of this thinking. I want to challenge you guys a bit, because human nature being what it is, most of us people like our knowledge, we like our credentials and our expertise. You want to get tenure, you want to be the best professor, worker, manager, leader. So we like our credentials and our knowledge track. Despite what we all like to say, we don't like to fail. Increasingly, we see less organizational aptitude for taking risks, for the notion of test and learn, which is the essence of certainly scientific exploration and I would assume in university. So no, give us a sense. How do Alison? How do you create that environment? And then I'd love to talk to Lydia and Matt and talk about how you're seeing that in an academic setting.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's a great question because ultimately people want to do well, right? We're pleasers. We hire at Google pretty much type A people who are successful. They're very accomplished and they're very skilled at what they do. And I think one of the things that we try to do, again, in our tiny little contained environment is allow people to do that thing of connecting things that don't otherwise seem that they should be connected. And we do that with that person's particular skills. So we have an invective in our team, which is spend 99.9% of your time making something only you can make with the skill you have, right? So a graphic designer should be making a poster. A coder should be making a prototype. People should not necessarily spread themselves out across and have a coder try and make a documentary film. That has happened. And we use storytelling, we use storytelling throughout. But I think this notion of clearly defined parameters and very specific problems is a freeing type of thing.
Gosh, yeah.
It's the constraint of that generative grid. Yeah. If you can't go outside the boundary of something, you're going to create more interesting combinations within. And if you're doing that, as a coder who knows C++ or whatever the latest thing, if you're making something in AR, I mean, our team in Australia, and our teams have slightly different flavors, and that's another thing where they're the ones that combine technology and feats of strength with cultural institutions. And they recently launched an AR experience in which you sit in your house and you have an opera on your phone. Now, is that the most useful thing in the world? No. Is it delightful? Was it a really hard thing to pull off with a whole new camera system? Did they invent a lot of things to make that possible? Yes. And so we say, great. It doesn't have to be a revolutionary thing. It can be a little piece of delight for someone who appreciates that and also gives access to an art form which is inaccessible, very expensive, and hard to find.
So it's a balance of experimentation, testing, but also within a framework and constraints. Know where you are.
Yeah.
Lydia, how do you think about it as with the students that you see? Are they risk takers? Are they taking the risk you think they should for these new jobs that we're going to need them to have?
Oh boy. Always hard for me to know what's the appropriate risk for somebody else. Sometimes I feel like you need to build confidence in this basic set of skills before you just put yourself out there. I've also seen people just go out there with none of the skills and I'm like, come back, don't do it. But one thing I am seeing increasingly, so I grew up before the internet and all my students grew up with the internet and this is good for our students, maybe not for history students, but we all know to use the internet as a crutch. Just how do I write this line of code? Stack Overflow, just type it in Google. I personally think that's a good thing. Maybe you should cite your sources, blah, blah, blah. But they are learning that the computer can amplify their ability. I'm really hoping that now nobody has to memorize the states and capitals anymore. I spent a year of my life doing that. I can still do it. Montana, Helena, I do all day long. Nobody does that anymore. And I think that we can maybe start to take more risks as we know the computers got your back on more of this basic level stuff. So I don't know, does anyone use Grammarly? Yeah, I no longer have to reread my emails 3 times to make sure I haven't said something dumb. The computer has done that for me. That is exponentially, and I sent a lot of email, not to toot my own horn, but But that is a crutch that I can just have and use, and if I need a software solution, I know it's on the web somewhere, and that allows me to take more risks. I still have to do the Norm Abrams thing and measure twice, cut once, because not everything on the internet actually works.
So you're making the case that a lot of automation has freed you as a human up for more risk-taking.
Not just automation, but connection to other human beings. So Stack Overflow is just other programmers saying, here was my solution to a thing, and they work, because guess what? We solve the same problems over and over again, and we just put them together in new ways.
Yeah.
And so I think you can get to the point where you can be creative and take risks sooner. I do think it's possible to do startups as an undergrad. Like you can do this. You don't necessarily have to know what every line of JavaScript could ever do. You can figure it out on the fly, and that's pretty powerful. And now it's really just about formulating the problems, because the internet's got you. It's got your back.
So we're going to come to some questions here in just a minute. So I want you to start thinking about some questions you have. Mickey, how do we start to think about, take us through how your generative learning model and how you might map some of these skills that we talked about earlier, problem solving, risk taking, creativity. How would this work? Do you have a creative mentor? I mean, are you just leveling up with a machine, saying, hey, now stop and daydream for 10 minutes?
Yeah.
How might this work?
It's a good question. I mean, again, I think this is still, I'm trying to maybe provoke more than I have answers for everything. But as we've been pulling through on this, we've been starting to see like, well, great, I can understand what they're doing in a tool. I can understand how you perform, and that's fine. But I don't know what you're thinking. I don't know why you made that extrusion that's going to become a teacup. I don't even know you're going to make a teacup. I really don't know. And the machine's not going to figure that out without some way of learning what your intent is, or helping you kind of actually get to a goal or a mission. So we've done some new stuff that's actually kind of interesting about kind of think aloud computing dynamically. While you're using, you're just kind of like, oh, I better go back and do that. And it's effectively, the machine occasionally says, what the heck are you trying to do? And we call it micro-reflections. It's just little teeny moments of micro-reflection that end up teaching the AI a little bit, not a lot, but also helps you, because what we find when you look at sort of people who have spent their lives being creative and drilling in on the literacies of different kinds of creativity and different kinds of just making, you find out that when they reflect, that you learn a lot, and they learn a lot. So actually, if you look at Lady Ada, who I mentioned earlier, who was one of the early computer programmers, I think ostensibly the first, for Babbage, her notebooks are beautiful. And she would reflect on those notebooks. Stephen Wolfram did a beautiful deep dive historical survey to see if she really was a programmer. And you can actually see the evolution of her thinking. And you can see her going back and seeing the evolution of her thinking and changing her mind over time. So I think some of this is reflection. Recently, we took 1,500, a very small number of Instructables. So we've got about 20 million people teach each other through this social tutorial tool called Instructable all around the world every month. And we started looking to see if we could detect anxiety, curiosity, risk, because they actually tell it like a hero's journey story. And we started seeing really interesting patterns in there about kind of as they were telling the story. Oh, I found 400 ways that this didn't work. You could actually see grit in there because they kept trying. You could sit there and start to see it. And we started wondering if we could just give that back to them. Not all the time. Actually, getting reflection all the time is not so good either. I need to like kind of stumble a bit. So I just wonder, there's that stuff. But the reason I say it's jazz is I don't think it's you and a machine. I think it might be you and a machine and another algorithm that's better at that, and this one I trust over here for that. But it's more of a jazz combo. And I mean that really literally. If you look at Wynton Marsalis, one of the best trumpeters in the world, he goes and does pickup little sets with people he doesn't know. And when he gets there, he's the trumpeter, the bass player goes wandering off into some place that Wynton's never heard.
Alison, do you see this kind of model at play? Would you recommend something similar?
It's funny because I was just thinking of that example we talked about. Again, our team in Australia, they've been very prolific of late, and they decided that they wanted to do something using machine learning and AI to help writers, right? So they developed a couple of experiments, and these are open source experiments. We do a lot of provocations to developers through our experiments platform, so they exist across all types of technologies. And so they created 3, and what they decided they wanted to check out was this synergy between AI and creativity, because there's a certain element the AI, if you train it on the right set, it can create. But how do you create a dialogue between a human creative by form of a writer and a machine learning model? And so they created a handful of them, but one I thought was really interesting is called BanterBot. And essentially they trained on a set of data that I believe Cornell has released, that's all of the scripts for every play that's ever been written, right? So they use that as a training model. The author gives a couple of key things about the character and literally starts to text back and forth with a bot that's generated by this model and can shape a character's dialogue and learn more about the character as the model gets smarter using the information the author is giving. And there's a series of authors, they went to a writers' festival and they had worked with these authors on these particular tools. And this woman said it was as if the machine was at the middle between her rational understanding of the character and her own subconscious, stretching it out, which I thought was
valuable.
so
Thanks for sharing that.
fascinating,
It was so
right? And it's
fascinating.
kind of like the optimistic side of all of this is, I think incredibly wonderful.
Yeah,
as I see it.
so on that optimistic note, I'd love some questions, and then I'm going to come back to Matt to kind of bring us home. Joseph, do you want people to come up, and would that be best?
You could come out.
Yeah. So Andy.
Thank you all. This has been incredibly insightful, interesting. You all brought up critical thinking as a component in various aspects of your background.
Can you
Yeah.
hear? Can you hear him?
Can you all hear me?
No.
I can project.
Yeah, you have to go on the
Yes,
microphone.
right,
Sorry.
okay. I use microphones ironically sometimes, but that's okay. So you all talk about critical thinking in very interesting ways based on your background. As some students here may be going out to the workforce, or some people change jobs at various points, how do you put critical thinking on a resume? Or how do you interview for that? Or how do you bring that into your team? Is that a fair question?
I know what I tell all my students: do a project. Show that you got this thing from beginning to end.
Yeah.
A whiteboard challenge?
A what?
A whiteboard challenge?
I don't know what that is, but it has to be something real in the world. I don't like this word whiteboard.
Because that's something that's common as students urging for their first jobs or people are transitioning, where it's like, all right, you're going to come in and you're going to work on something, and we want to see how you think. And that's polarizing in some aspects.
Yeah.
It's like, all right, you pay me for my time, or you going to use this work? So how does it?
Could also
I think it's
reward
really
extroverts.
I'm sorry?
It could reward extroverts and other kinds of things. I think, what I noticed is, I think it relates to what she was just saying is when I used to hire designers and cognitive psychologists and others, I would say, we're going to do a portfolio review, but I don't really want to see the end product. I want to see the process, like your sketchbook. I want to see how you failed and how you explored. Because watching how they think, and you can see it in a sketchbook. They tried 52 options, then they were like, that's dumb, and then they went off, and then they changed their goals. You can learn so much. And there are some schools that they actually prepare you where you have the process. You see the dead ends, you see the things, and it's actually a part of the portfolio. A lot of schools don't. And oftentimes when you're like a cognitive psychologist and you went to interview at Maya, and they'd be like, you're going to have to show a portfolio in front of everybody. They'd be like, what the hell's a portfolio for me? And often it was about make something, because it helps us see. Just make a cake, make a fix to a lamp, make a dance move. Whatever you made that didn't have to do with school, that didn't have to do with work, teaches us a lot, because you get to see it in
Great.
the outer
Thanks.
artifacts.
We have some more questions. I was going to come up and.
I will just.
Oh, actually, Joseph will find you. Great.
It'll be easier.
Hi. So I was thinking about the slides that started this whole presentation, and about automation and about all of these things. And as I'm sure Professor Jones is very aware, some of us are reading Rousseau right now. And my question is, so as we approach more integration of human technology interactions, and as this increases more and more our efficiency and our ability to do things, how do we reconcile that with the increasing fast-paced nature of our society, and as it gets more and more fast-paced, would it not eventually destroy us, and how do we deal with that?
I want to
Matt,
find out from the
yeah.
historian.
I think it's
So I
really-
think one
it's
thing we
really
might say that we don't want our KPI to be efficiency, but more seriously, it is precisely what is it that we are producing things for. And in following the sort of the inspiration of people who actually make things as opposed to pontificate, the question is very much how, I mean, one thing that the lesson of, say, the recent history of computing is the way in which small projects can leverage and cause vast, large-scale effects. Most of those have been about accumulation of capital, but there's no reason that has to be the way that it need be. That there's many ways that in which the problems we're interested in are facets of crucial social problems, say, structural inequality or something. We can't resolve that immediately, but through smaller efforts, we have a lot of skill now in thinking about how to leverage facets of those to cause dramatic change. And this can be at the level of social organization. So one of the greatest transformations, I would say, in practical political philosophy in the last 30 years are those ways by which programmers produce code socially. That is, things like Git. That, we don't think of that as a political technology. It's a fundamental technology of what the nature of collaboration is going to do. We don't do enough of that. We do a lot of capital accumulation, but that's not the way. And so one of the lessons ought to be is how has scale worked, and how can we make scale work in ways for things that we care more about, like opera or
literacy. So there's a product, Google Lens, right? And again, our team tries to find little ways that these things exist that shine a light on something that's virtuous. And there's a beautiful film of a woman in India who is illiterate, and she's able to use Google Lens to read her children's report card because it'll just read it aloud to her. And that's pretty astonishing in terms of like the best of what Google is access to information and empowering people through the technology itself and iterating on that. So I think I don't have the answer for how to slow down. I mean, I think we all feel like we're sliding down a big mud mountain about to hit a big wall at the bottom. But I think if we can find these moments of intersection between the human condition in its rawest form and what technology can enable, you can feel a little bit better about all the rest of it.
But I think this issue of just accelerating speed is worrying most people. Mickey, you actually called out speed of learning. I mean, is there a limit, he's asking?
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, two things. One, the reason I did the exit level intern thing was because I needed a gap year. I needed time to reboot and think and not feel like I was in this rat race or this mouse race or whatever. And I think we don't enable that. We don't actually honor that you get a degree in 4 years. Harvard, Columbia, et cetera, they don't order subscribe to life and occasionally take a gap month, a gap year, a gap day, a gap 5 years, and actually reward that, invest in your own learning or your own reflection. And I think we're going to have to develop tools and methods and just a culture that rewards napping in the afternoon. Turns out that's pretty usul, by the way.
So pausing or going slow to go
pausing,
fast.
And also we're entering an era of asymmetries. So in the military context or in the nation-state context, they used to be able to fight each other and they had equal things. I have a nuclear bomb, you have a nuclear bomb. But there's an iGEM program that is high school kids learning how to use an open wetware library to make new viruses and new organisms. It's for high school kids. It's been going for 10 years. And that means a high school kid has more power than ever before. Any given person, if we succeed in democratizing a lot of these innovations, which I think we want to in some ways, any given person can wipe out a city by mistake. And that's kind of scary, right? Because it should be scary. And so, but we're not teaching ethics necessarily. We're not teaching the ethics about how to say no. We're not also giving children potentially in this future state a chance to be children. Because you do screw up a lot as a kid, and that's how we learn. We learn through desirable difficulty, struggling.
So the speed also has to allow time to fail.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm a physician. I'm in the business of keeping people healthy and tending to health and well-being. So I see the wreckage of some of this and the acceleration in my office every day.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about if there's any forethought about keeping us, our new, very deep, very fast relationship with machines. We are not machines fully yet. But if there's been any mind paid, who's minding the shop as we're so-called going through these changes, or if there's been any thinking about that, because I see it every day with my patients.
I mean, there is a lot of thinking about that, right? So digital well-being is a platform that we've started to develop, and our team just did a bunch of little experiments for Android, one of which is a little unlock clock that every time you flip your phone and open it, it mounts a number. It's very visceral. And again, this is an open source thing. They want people to play in the space of how do you help people detach from these devices that have become, not to mention the email and all the other things. But these are critical issues, and I think it is that balance between what you raised with the speed of execution and productivity and all of these drivers of capital accumulation, which are a critically important part of our society as we've defined it.
So
And
this
the
might be a
counterpoint
good
to
topic
that.
for a future panel here
Oh
too.
my
Yeah.
gosh.
We
Yeah.
have some more questions. I want to make sure we get to folks. We've got the one right there in the middle, I think's been very patient.
Thank you. So I think I know where you're coming from. I taught at Rhode Island School of Design and Architecture for 15 years, and I teach here now in sustainability management. And what I've observed in the difference between an art school and Columbia is the emphasis on methodology and replicability, and the acceptance that not everyone is going to be 0.001% of creatives operating in the current economy. And I'm wondering about how this paradigm, if it's not to be vocational, works out in a culture that values the predictable outcome.
Do you want to have a point of view on that?
I have plenty of points of view on that, but I don't know. I talk too much, so.
Matt, did you have something you were going to say?
I don't really know the answer to that, other than I think one of the remarkable things that you hear in this conversation, that you hear in the practice of, say, computer programming by Googling and Stack Overflow, is the extent to which we more and more are changing our folk conception of what creativity is, away from the individual author that somehow produces Faust, towards something that it's built in communities of various kinds. And resetting our thinking about that, I think, can make us have we could think really broadly about what does that mean about reward structures, of how we celebrate excellence in production. Both of you have spoken about people who can dive down deep in their excellence and are nonetheless not only using a hammer to continue hammering nails when they're really using screws. So I think that's a very hard question, but the extent that we are at a moment at which we simultaneously are constantly talking about creativity and disruption and all these kinds of things. And yet, when we talk about how people are producing the kinds of things, we are celebrating a much richer kind of a vision of what creativity and action is.
And to build on that, I think there's a growing recognition that a definition of creativity is the ability to navigate complexity and the ability to connect disparate things and create something new. So it's not necessarily the lone creative artist who's just doing something. We had a couple more questions I want to get to.
Hi there. Very much enjoying this. Thank you. This might be for the next panel, but I work in leadership development and more recently corporate leadership development. And I'm having these conversations with heads of learning all the time. And there's this idea of gamification. I keep hearing it, so I had to understand what it was. And I had to understand machine learning too. But there's this idea that inside of companies we're actually rewarding staying inside the box and not risk-taking and keeping our heads down. And Beth, you alluded to it, that it's hard to change inside of companies. So whether gamification or outside of gamification, is there a way to reward critical thinking, risk-taking, innovation, the competencies that all of you have, very awesomely talked about tonight? How do we actually do that inside of a company to rally around and get people to be creative and do the hard, messy, awkward change?
So that's such a great question. I think we're going to end on that question. I'm going to ask each of you to reflect on that. And as you're doing that, I'd kind of like a summary of how do we answer her question, and then maybe what would be a takeaway you'd like someone, a takeaway you'd like someone to take from the discussion tonight. So Lydia, let me start with you.
My answer to that is that I kind of feel like it's my job to instill that while you're still in university, because it's a chance it's a playground. You don't have to get straight A's, as it turns out. I really think you should take on, and I really try to get students out of the mindset of, this is a class, there are assignments, I need to get an A, that is my metric. That is inside the box thinking. And that can be very addictive. There is a gamified version of that where, very set of expectations, and fulfilling them is fun. in a way. There's a pleasure there. And so what am I going to do? Take that away and give you a whole bunch of uncertainty? No, I think that there is a greater pleasure in solving real problems, and you just have to taste that for the first time. And I feel like school does not always do that fantastically, which is why I tell people, how do you demonstrate my critical thinking? Take something, initiate it, do it in the real world. Like, teach a class to somebody else. I always do this to students. I'm like, you learn something, teach it. Teach it to 3 people. I don't care what. This is incredibly empowering, but you gotta push them over the edge to do it.
Your takeaway, I think, is teach something. So that's a challenge for everybody here. Matt.
I think I'd sort of widen the scope, look at it both this micro thing. Gamification means it is a form of organizing our incentives so that we do none of what we're talking about. and it's powerfully designed. I mean, it originates in keeping you in a casino and never leaving. In a window. I mean, literally, this is where the phenomena comes from. But it's intimately related to those forms of finance which discourage certain kinds of business activity. And so I would think this is something that you need to focus on both at, say, our reward structures, whether in a university setting, in a corporate setting, or elsewhere, but also fundamentally in what are the kind of reward structures that we are going to allow to exist. We know, for example, whatever the problems with VC is, VC allowed a different kind of temporal dimension to thinking in California in the 80s and 90s, and we both benefit and suffer because of that. But that is reasons why aspects of that culture weren't gamified. So I think we actually need to, coming back to what do we walk away with, we need to teach people to think about how technical practices are intimately related to the reward structures and that enable and disable people from doing various kinds of things. And many of the odious aspects of new technology are precisely because we have reward structures that are rewarding only those negative things, whether it's the medical case or another.
Right. Thank you. Alison.
So funny, I'm thinking very much along his lines, which is ultimately, in a corporate structure, it's about your paycheck, right? Because your paycheck is driven by your performance rating, which is your pat on the head at any particular moment in time. And so how do you make that structure of evaluation more elastic to include those intangible things that we've quantified? What makes a good leader? A good leader might fail with a product launch, but have leadership qualities that are very strong. You need to reward those with compensation to motivate that and encourage that behavior collectively.
And one thing you'd
My
ask-
one thing is totally nothing to do with that. I was just thinking about it, which is we are all very insulated from each other as human beings. And so I think we all need to work a bit harder on making a point of human connection that is new or different from our existing structure or pattern of behavior.
Thank you. Nikki.
I liked your question about gamification or game mechanics. It probably started a little bit before Las Vegas. You play with a puppy, and you build trust with that Great Dane puppy before it gets so big it'll bite your head off or something. So play is actually just a part of how we grow neurons. It's called desirable difficulty. If it's too easy, you give up, you're bored. If it's too hard, you give up, it's too hard. And you're trying to find this sweet spot that they call flow and trying to get there. The problem is it's been kind of co-opted for one objective function like engagement or something at Facebook or some other place. And so we're effectively kind of strip mining our brains. And when the last time we found that big industrialists were strip mining our brains, we created an EPA. We probably need maybe at least an FDA for our mind. It would be nice to be able to kind of look at what we're putting in our brains the same way we're looking at what we're putting in our foods. That's actually what Netta shaped and told me I better focus on because she's really worried about this. There's a wonderful conference called Games for Change, and it's a 15, 16-year conference at Parsons that is about play for purpose and understanding the underlying mechanisms there. The problem is we've taken the sort of easy parts and just created these dark patterns where we amplify engagement. So that's my kind of shake on that. My one thing is actually going back to what you said at the very beginning, which is we're entering a more and more complex world. And I don't think we're studying complexity as such. And if you look at some of the wonderful work about theories of complexity, there are all these crazy emergent things that pop up. That thing that sounded really good led to this unintended consequence. There are animals hiding in complexity. But how many people in this room have read like Donella Meadows' 10 Ways of Shaping a Complex System? Probably not a lot. We got somebody, I saw it, great. But there are real theories here about complexity, and we're entering an era that I would claim is unbounded malignant complexity. Nature's had to deal with unbounded malignant complexity for 3 billion years on this planet. Maybe we should study nature and complex systems.
I echo that. Thank you all for being here. We have a reception outside where you can keep the conversation going. You're welcome to stay. And again, thank you for spending your evening with us. Hopefully this sparked just a few ideas and provocations for you as you build your playlist for the future you. Thank you, and thank you to CSS.